Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.
Hello and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Beth Courtney, President of Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
And I'm Robert Travis Scott, President of the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana. Well, shortly after Governor John Bel Edwards' inauguration in January, he called lawmakers to Baton Rouge to take action on a $2 billion shortfall in the state budget.
Well, Robert, they got to work just after Valentine's Day and kept at it until the end of June. They worked through an extraordinary or special session, through the regular session, and another 3-week special session after that.
And at the end, they were correcting laws that were hastily passed in the first session.
Well, confusing. Robert, they were in session a very long time, but how did the length of time at the Capitol affect the laws that were made? Are the state spending's priorities in the right place? Who will be paying higher taxes and by how much? Over the next hour, we'll hear from families who rely on state services for their children, lawmakers who called the shots, and business folks worried about how taxes might affect the economy. We'll explore these issues and more on Regular and Extraordinary Legislative Review. Of all the funding decisions lawmakers made during the 3 sessions this year, the state's college scholarship program, TOPS, will see the biggest impact. That's according to Commissioner Jay Dardenne. He's Governor John Bel Edwards' right-hand man when it comes to the budget.
We do have a balanced budget, but the point is we do not have enough money to fund everything that has been funded in the previous year. And so there are going to be cuts visited upon various state agencies and obviously on the TOPS program.
The program was allocated 70% of the money it needs. In a last-minute deal, lawmakers decided to front-load TOPS. That means they would fully fund it in the fall semester, pushing the shortfall to the spring. College students and their parents may have to come up with thousands of dollars in tuition if the state doesn't find more cash. Lawmakers were willing to take that bet because they think there's potentially more money on the way. Representative Neil Abramson leads the House committee that vets tax policy. He said as much after voting to put restrictions on a revenue-raising measure in committee.
And there are many, many opportunities that exist. The price of oil goes up, which it already has, and so we're going to generate more revenue already from the price of oil.
Abramson said he thought some of the revenue bills passed would end up bringing in more money than originally estimated. Dardenne said that's an irresponsible way to budget.
From a legislator's standpoint, obviously to reduce the number of tax votes that have to be made or to reduce the amount of money to be raised in new taxes, you want to say we're going to get money coming later on. We have to be conservative and we have to be prudent in how we gauge those expectations.
As the week stacked up, so did the number of votes lawmakers were asked to take to raise revenue. Lawmakers raised about $1.5 billion since February.
Sometimes I just think it's we have to stand up for our constituents and say enough's enough.
Representative Philip DeVilliers is a Republican from Eunice. He told Representative Rob Shadowin, who was promoting a revenue bill around week 17, that lawmakers need to let the dust settle. DeVilliers wanted to see the final numbers before he approved anything else.
It's just really hard for me to go back home because I haven't been able to do that since we got started. And, go see.
You mean go back home?
Yeah, go back home, talk to the people who elected me and actually feel, their pain right now.
That notion was echoed by Stephen Wagasback, president of the influential Louisiana Association of Business and Industry. He says oil prices have caused a downturn in the economy.
There are jobs out there that are hurting. We are 16,000 jobs down. We have to be mindful of that. We have been here for 6 months.
That atmosphere made it difficult to consider tax policy changes that some consider real reform. Kenner Republican Julie Stokes expressed frustration that those issues met hurdles this year.
We can't stop talking about this budget problem long enough to do anything really good.
As did Senate President John Alario.
We can't keep going year to year and find ourselves in a hole. We've got to stabilize the revenue sources and try to be fair about how we do that.
Dardenne says that the budget first needed to be stabilized. Next session, the administration is gearing up to make structural changes.
Louisiana's lurched from year to year with revenues up and down and changes in its tax code that haven't really been structural changes. They've just been changes that we needed to make to deal with the present problem.
In the first special session, lawmakers tacked another cent onto the 4-cent sales tax. They also got rid of several exemptions to the tax, making more goods taxable. However, they accidentally took off more exemptions than they meant to. That caused confusion regarding how much cash the increase would produce. Those changes and others are set to expire. That means in the 2018 session, lawmakers will be looking at least a $1.1 billion shortfall in funding.
It creates this terrible cliff, and we're back in the same soup of having to deal with the crisis of not having adequate revenue. The plan and the hope is that next year, the structural changes that are advanced will address the cliff problem and undo some of the temporary fixes that were put in place this year.
Dardenne says the administration is walking a fine line between being sensitive to the economy and making sure everyone pays their fair share.
It is a balancing act. It's an ongoing discussion that's going to take place as to what's the right mix of being fair to everyone and not being punitive toward a particular sector of the economy or a particular business, but also recognizing that to have a balanced, broad-based tax structure, you've got to hit the various entities that are going to be contributing to the base.
All eyes are on a study commission led by Dr. Jim Richardson. The group is expected to release recommendations for the tax code this fall.
Well, joining us to explore the regular and extraordinary sessions is our studio audience. It includes college students, educators, and activists. We also have students from the Legislative Youth Advisory Council from New Orleans and Rayne. Well, thanks to everyone for being here. Well, it's been noted how difficult it was to keep track of all the numbers surrounding the session. So let's start there. Here's the best apples-to-apples comparison we can make based on the figures from the House Fiscal Division. First, for the new fiscal year, the state's colleges and universities will see a 2% increase in their funding over last year by about $40 million. K through 12 schools will experience a small drop, less than 1% of their budget, of about $16 million. The Louisiana Department of Health will see an increase of about 8%, about $280 million. Lawmakers have left the Department of Corrections about 1% short, about $6 million. But those numbers don't paint the entire picture. What else do you think should have been funded? What tax increases are you expecting? Or is this a spending problem, as some people have suggested? So, Janae, tell us a little bit about your impression on those questions coming out of all these sessions, which I believe you were monitoring as part of the Louisiana Budget Project. Is that right?
Yes. I think from our perspective as an organization, our biggest concern is that the solutions that were developed will create a problem in the next couple of years, and that also, while there weren't a lot of options for how to fill budget holes quickly, those that were chosen are options that affect your lowest income folks in the state more than anyone else. And when there were opportunities to put into place policies that would actually distribute that burden more progressively, that legislators were unwilling to pursue them. So,
I see. So you think they should have raised revenue in different ways and not with the sales tax? Do you think that was a bad idea? Or?
Definitely not with the sales tax.
Okay. It seemed like it was a lot of quick money that coming up there. Jay, you are a businessman in representing Louisiana Association of Business and Industry. How did you see the session going, and do you agree with Janae?
To a certain extent, yes, but I think the reality was the legislators were put in a very difficult position in a very short period of time. And I think their goal was to create a bridge to get to true reform. And what they did, even though very distasteful and very unpleasant and very costly to business at a time when businesses are struggling, particularly in the oil patch, it was something that had to be done in a short-term basis with the reality that we must do reform. And reform's got to take place in the regular session next year, which is a fiscal year.
Okay. Well, yes, go ahead, Edgar. You want to jump in?
Yes. To say that the legislature was put in position in a short period of time is maybe an accurate statement, but this did not happen in the first special session. It had been happening in previous administrations before. We're building up to this.
So it took us years to get in this bad a shape, is what you're saying?
Absolutely.
So, okay.
Absolutely. And I agree that the sales tax increase, the most aggressive for people who low income, who have little means. But our community, Together Louisiana, we understood, we didn't like it, but this was the only source of revenue that you can get quickly. Anything else, income tax, would happen at the end of the year. But we needed it for the last fiscal year, so that's why we didn't like it, but we didn't oppose it because the administration had nothing else to.
The biggest source of quick revenue is what you're saying. Nathan?
I have to agree with Edgar's statement. I think anybody that thinks the legislation that came out of this session would be a long-term fix is maybe fooling themselves, and it's just a bridge to get to the tax reform of the next session. But importantly to note is the fact that over 8 years of cuts or things like this, we can't let the new normal define our expectations. So when we talk about funding from the previous year, funding from 4 years prior, we need to keep in check the idea of whether that was acceptable to begin with.
Yes, and you're a freshly graduated economist, is that right?
I'm a recent graduate of LSU with a degree in economics.
Okay, we have some students here, and I'd like to hear from the students what their view is, or prospective college students especially, what your view is of TOPS. For the first time, we don't have full funding of TOPS, and are any of you affected by this, or do you have a view of whether that was a good idea or not? Leah? Taylor?
I feel like we don't necessarily like it, but we don't really have much of a choice either because the cuts can only come from so many places. So they didn't really have much of a choice except for to start cutting from TOPS.
And in other words, you thought that was a natural place for them to go?
I feel like it should be better. We shouldn't have to cut from TOPS in hospitals, but they had to do what they had to do, and they had to do it quick before reforms next year.
And Justin here is both a student, college student, and he was a journalist working through the Manship School covering the session. And so are you affected by the
I just graduated. I'm going to law school next year.
You got out just in time.
I know, yes. Actually, I just wrote a column about my experiences at the Capitol and how my views have changed. Originally, I would say maybe a year ago that we should fund TOPS 100%, but if 4 hospitals are on the chopping block, I would argue that TOPS should be cut instead of those hospitals. And on top of that, if the 2017 regular session does not provide tax code changes and structural changes elsewhere within the Constitution, then TOPS and higher education will continue to be problems for our legislature to face. And the program as it stands today requires additional reforms for that to happen.
About that. And Rebecca, you are a journalist covering, you covered this session, right, for The Advocate?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you agree with his assessment of what happened in the session?
I think it's worth noting that this is the first time TOPS has been cut, and we've been cutting the state budget really aggressively for the past 8 or 9 years. So it's definitely been a priority, and it was very difficult for legislators and for the governor to make that cut, but I think it shows how severe things had gotten.
Yeah, and we're fortunate to have with us tonight Scott Richard with the School Boards Association. Scott, I know you have a lot to say about what happened in this session. Are you better off? Are you worse off? How did it go?
It's certainly a sad day in Louisiana when K-12 public education is not prioritized and not kept at least the same level of funding from the previous year. One of the biggest takeaways from this session for anybody that's a stakeholder is the fact that basic services in state government were pitted against each other, jockeying for funding. Higher ed, hospitals, waiver, children with severe disabilities, adults with severe disabilities, K-12 public education, prison services, basic services that states provide were pitted, actually fighting against each other at the end of the day to try to champion their cause to at least maintain the same level of funding.
It often ends up that way, where they pit one constituency against another, and that's part of how they get support for one thing or another. But let's talk about health care just a little bit. And we have with us a couple of folks who you have a special interest in health care, and I wonder if Kelly or Karen, tell us just a little bit about that.
Yes, I have a son who has 2 developmental disabilities, Down syndrome and autism, and a congenital heart defect. And I'm also working with Trach Mamas of Louisiana, who support children who are medically fragile and technology dependent. You may have seen us at the Capitol advocating for services, Medicaid waiver services for our kids.
And a lot of people don't know what that means. What is a Medicaid waiver?
Medicaid waiver in general, just really briefly, is a waiver of regular Medicaid rules to provide help and support to people with disabilities or special needs.
All right. So how did things come out from your point of view?
Well, it was very scary. It was a very, very scary session for us personally and for the families that I work with.
Was it scary because you thought the funding was going to be taken away that you already
had? And actually
had,
twice. We were put in a position to where we had to go and advocate not once but twice to get our services put back into the budget. During the special session to have the funding found and placed back in the budget, and then it was in House Bill 1 and taken out at one point.
And at the end, how did it turn out?
The waiver services were covered, but many other services for developmental disability services weren't.
And Karen, the lesson for you going forward on this, what would you want to see done differently in the future? I mean, there are all these priorities. You have your own priority. What would you like to see happen?
Well, what I'd like to see happen is to have reforms so that we aren't pitting services against each other. I mean, that would be the ideal and the sane response, but when it comes down to it, and I appreciate what some of the other panelists said, they understood about TOPS, and they understood kind of the situation we were in. Our children, many of our children, not all of them, but certainly many of them, could die without the services that they have. And there were many parents put in that situation and that fear this year.
Okay. I know, Diane, you wanted to jump in just a minute ago. Here's your turn.
Thank you. I think what I'm hearing here is that spending is not the problem, that we have things that are necessary and priorities. So for me personally, I have a son that's got TOPS. We'll be losing that. I have a family member who has a personal care attendant around the clock. That's going to be looked at as being cut. My husband works for the State Department, and he now works 5 jobs for 5 people that have been laid off because of cuts.
You're saying he's taken the responsibility of 5 different jobs.
Of 5 people, okay, because they have been over the years. And then on top of all that, I was asked, well, would you add a penny to sales tax at the same time as my air conditioner went out? So I felt that penny right away. And so what's frustrating to me is we all talk about how, well, okay, I'll give up the TOPS. Okay, I'll give up the funding for my family member that needs that round-the-clock PCA. Okay, I'll pay that penny. So we keep talking about how, I mean, it's impacting me in a very powerful way, and I'm stretched to the limit now. But are we talking about, so how do we get revenue? We need to talk about how we get revenue, because these priorities are too important to be pitting them against each other.
Thank you for sharing your situation. That's all the time we have for this portion of our show. When we return, we'll be joined by our panel to further explore regular and extraordinary legislative review. Welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight we're reviewing the legislature's recently concluded regular and extraordinary sessions. Joining us now is our panel of experts. Senator Eric LaFleur is chair of the Senate Finance Committee that handles the budget. He's a Democrat from Ville Platte who has served in the legislature since 1999. Melinda DeLotte, Capital Ace of the Associated Press, has covered Louisiana politics since 2000. A Laplace native, she graduated from LSU and received her master's from the University of Maryland. Dr. Jim Richardson, he may know more than anyone else about the deficiencies in the state's revenue structure. He has served on the committee that estimates how much the state can spend each year since 1987. and Representative Melinda White, a Democrat from Bogalusa. She's new to the Capitol, but that didn't stop her from authoring some hefty tax policy changes. Well, we've reached out to several prominent Republican lawmakers, and all of them had prior commitments. Well, before we go to our audience, I'd like to ask all of you to address a question. You know, we entered this first special session in a serious fiscal crisis. Now we're done. Are we out of the crisis? And what were the big successes or failures going through these last few months? We're going to start with you, Senator LaFleur.
Well, I guess one of the biggest failures of this session was our inability to fully fund TOPS, or the unwillingness of the legislature to pass appropriate revenue measures to fully fund TOPS, which I think is a very important program. The governor made the appropriate proposals, but the legislature chose not to fund it, and I think they're probably the biggest loser as far as dollars go. And then there's a whole bunch of others in the course of government that will lose a few dollars. DHH, for example, Department of Corrections, among many.
And you're on the Senate side. Do you think the Senate would have fully funded TOPS and done what they wanted to do, or
Yes.
was it the House?
Yes, I feel comfortable that the Senate would have passed the measures that would have fully funded
I just
TOPS.
wanted to stir up a little bicameral controversy. Ms. DeLotte.
Well, I'll leave the successes and failures to other folks to discuss, but I'll say in terms of whether or not things are settled and we're in a balanced budget situation, I'd say that everybody's in a balanced budget situation for now. It seems highly questionable. Legislators don't really seem to know what they've passed entirely in terms of what the money will generate that will come in for paying for things, and beyond that, there is the potential of a budget deficit from the fiscal year that just ended. There are potentials for holes in the budget for this year. So I would say it is an over-assumption to suggest that everything is fine and dandy.
Yes, yes. You've been covering legislative sessions for many years. On a scale of 1 to 10, from bad to good, how would you rate this one compared to the others you've seen?
Long.
Good answer, good answer.
19 weeks in a row of 3 sessions is probably more than anybody should be asked to do, reporter or legislator or member of the public watching it.
Right.
Kids would agree.
Dr. Richardson, you are probably one of the most well-known economists in the state at LSU, also on the Revenue Estimating Conference. How did you view what just happened in the last 6 months?
I think a couple of things will say they did well in terms of trying to redefine the corporate income tax base. Those are little bitty things behind the scenes, don't show up much publicly. On those things, I think they did a very nice job. On the broader picture of the overall budget, we are still very cloudy about if we really solved the budget problems for even this coming fiscal year. Obviously, we did not do it for the long term. That's going to be coming up next session. But even in the short term, many of the tax changes, the numbers that are being used to project what we will get from them, very, very shaky, I think, very soft, very unsure of ourselves about how much money we really will get in the end. And on top of that, you have the ongoing economy, which is dragging a little bit because the energy sector not doing nearly as well as it once was. So I think in that sense, I would, to a certain extent, I think for this fiscal year we just ended, there almost surely will be a shortage of funds. There will be a deficit from this past fiscal year almost for sure. And then I would not be surprised if we had to bring another session in early January.
Well, that's a sobering thought. Things have gotten worse before they've even gotten better. I appreciate that, Dr. Richardson. How about you, Representative White? Do you have a more positive outlook on our crisis?
Well, as a freshman legislator, I went into this process as a student of the process. The thing that I found most good for me in the beginning was to be able to attend Ways and Means and Appropriations and watch bills get vetted out and understand the impacts to so many people, and that helped me understand when we went into it, and I just wanted to dive in and help. I wasn't sitting here to sit on the sidelines, and I ran a campaign on not kicking the can down the road. So I immediately stepped in with what things that I knew about, such as vendor compensation fees and things like that I could deliver on, and it was a spending cut. So there's, the process, though, after 3 sessions, I definitely feel like I'm no longer a freshman.
I don't think anybody's a freshman anymore after going through all that. And how dare you as a legislature try to capitalize on things you actually know about. Dr. Richardson is the chairman of a task force created by the legislature to try to revamp our fiscal picture in the state, and that report is due on September 1st, so we'll take a look at that. But we want to go to David. David, you had a question about all the exemptions and credits and whatnot that sort of interfere with our revenue picture. Why don't you ask the panel about that?
Well, I appreciate it. Just speaking as an individual taxpayer, I was concerned about some of the things were proposed. And I, like many people, I'm able to, take advantage of things, mortgage interest write-off, and things like that. I think the elimination or the decreasing of those credits on when I do my taxes and all the other people in the state. Personally, I guess I think it's kind of a bad idea. It hurts the middle class people, and I think it hurts almost all homeowners anyone that's got a mortgage. And I was just a little bit curious if they're still going to beat that drum, if the governor is going to still be beating the drum next year.
In particular, personal or individual income taxes is what you're talking about.
The deductions that you get from your federal tax
How do our
returns,
legislators want to
like
react,
mortgage interest?
React to
I think
that?
the one the governor proposed would have excluded that write-off. So you still enjoy that write-off, even with the governor's proposal.
But charitable donations and things like that we write off legitimately.
Representative White?
I actually carried that bill. Representative Rob Shadowin carried it in the first round, and when it failed, I had a bill the same and worked to make that bill something that would actually bring about tax reform in a good way. And so basically, just it was one that allowed you all tax deductions with the exemption of state income tax and sales and use tax. That was it. And furthermore, this impact that we talk about for someone making the salary of $100,000 a year would have cost them $200. To go to the furthest end of that, of someone making $1 million a year, it would have been a price tag of around $2,500. And in lieu of the services that it would have covered in our basic human needs, would have been tremendous. And this year it would have brought in $88 million collectively from these tax deductions, exemptions. It would not affect your mortgage interest, your charitable contributions, or any of the federal tax, that you can claim on your federal taxes.
Well, you may get another chance. You may get another chance to talk about that next year. It may come back.
Yes.
Frederick,
yes.
You had a question about a topic that everyone groaned and sighed about when we brought it up earlier, the TOPS. What would you like to ask the panel about TOPS?
Well, yes, I'm a recent high school graduate. I just graduated this past May. And TOPS is, of course, on every high school senior's mind. It was on my mind, definitely. And what we want to know is there a plan in place? And this, I guess, question is directed more towards the two legislators. Is there a plan in place to fully fund TOPS in subsequent years? And that the promise that was made to students is upheld?
That's a good question, and we're going to let the legislators answer it. But Melinda, why don't you just tell us factually what happened to TOPS?
They didn't fully fund it. What they did this time is, first of all, they passed a law that caps the spending on TOPS so that it doesn't necessarily grow as the cost of tuition grows. So, for example, if LSU wanted to raise its tuition in future years, the legislature doesn't necessarily have to increase the payments from TOPS to match the tuition cost that the school carries. But then, setting that aside for future years, they didn't immediately pay for the full program now. So students will face a cut for the award in the upcoming school year, a small cut in the fall and a bigger cut in the spring. So, and to your question, I don't think there is anything that suggests there is a sustainable plan for the long term to continue funding TOPS and to make sure that everybody who is eligible actually receives the funding.
How about our legislators? Do you agree? Do we have a
well,
long-term
the
plan?
current revenue measures that we have in place won't fund most anything, not much less TOPS. We'd be in a catastrophe if we don't pick something else as far as revenue measures, or we don't renew what's currently in place. But there was a plan in place to fully fund TOPS this year, but the legislature rejected it and refused to pass the revenue measures that would have provided full funding.
Do you have children in college? Or
I have had children in college from 2004, 3 children, starting in 2004 and just graduating in 2016, this year.
Were they TOPS students?
They were TOPS students, and I understood that completely. What I didn't understand is how all the funding worked until I got here. And when I listened to a gentleman that was over several colleges up north explain to me how in the past 60 years higher education had been cut by 70%, which drove their cost up. And so while that cost was being driven up, I watched my children's, from one to the other, their TOPS go up. And so we're just shifting tax dollars from one to the other to compensate for the rising cost. And really, the burden was carried on the backs of the parents and the students.
Yeah, and that's often how it works. Now, a lot of that shifting of burden, especially for revenue, I think a lot of people in the business community have thought, well, they're taking more from us, than they're taking from individuals. Monique, you are with the Baton Rouge Area Chamber, is that correct?
Exactly. I chaired BRAC's legislative committee this year.
Oh, you had your hands full.
It was a very long session, and I learned a lot. And BRAC and several EDOs and our investors are concerned about the anti-business sentiment that seemingly befell the legislature this year. And we're concerned about the economic posture of our state. There are large industry that have business expansion plans, and we were on the table to be considered for those expansions, and now they're redirecting those elsewhere. What do you propose will be the next steps to fund so that the brunt of the budget shortfall doesn't fall to business?
I'd like Dr. Richardson to try to address this balance with business and individual.
Well, if you go back and just see what we did, we first started really raising taxes to meet shortfalls in our budget in 2015. And almost all of those tax increases, though they were not called tax increases, that's what they were really focused on business, on cutting back credits, cutting back exemptions. That was kind of the focus. And that, when it got into the new year, 2016, and a new governor, and they needed money in a hurry, they then went to the sales tax, which is more individual oriented, but also businesses pay that too. It's not just individuals. And then they also did some more cutting on the tax credits as well, some more haircuts, I think they called them, to those. I think those were elements, and that's where they could get money. And also, even if you listen to both sides, the Democrats and Republicans, the general statement was, well, business has got to pay its share. That was kind of the focus. And I think as we think about redoing the tax structure, one of the elements you have to do is you have to make sure that tax structure, one, it generates a revenue the state thinks it needs to spend on important programs, which be from education to health care to prisons to highways, etc. But number two, it also has to be, and I say business friendly, it cannot be so anti-competitive or so anti-business that essentially you do make people stand up and think about us as a place to invest. And that is always an interesting balance. I think the problem is as we go along there, I think the governor, the legislators, they're very aware of that delicate balance. Now, do they always come up with the same answer, same conclusion? No, not necessarily. But I think that's something that's going to be a driving point as we go about reforming the tax code over the next several years, yes.
That's right. Now, Representative from Law B, Jay, probably thinks that it's a very interesting balance indeed. Do you want to follow up with a question on that?
I would, and I would address it to our two legislators that are here, is that given the fact that this past several sessions we had tax increases, we had credit curtailment, and we had some other payments that were either eliminated or shortfall like vendors' comp, We know that was all a bridge to get to true reform. We have a task force headed by Dr. Richardson. We have another task force dealing with the inventory tax. We have another task force dealing with sales tax streamlining and modernization. And all of these reports are going to coalesce pretty close to the beginning of the regular session in 2017. Do you see an appetite to do true reform, which includes constitutional amendments, which includes statutory reform and dedications, constitutional dedications? A variety of things are going to be, at times, very difficult to do, but it's going to take will to do that. Do you see that will?
It is the question of the hour, and I ask both our legislators to address that.
Well, I think the will is there. I mean, one thing about taxes and who's going to pay them is, like this gentleman pointed out, he doesn't want to give up his exemption. Businesses don't want to give up their exemptions. There's not a person here that wants to give up their tops. We are all self-interested in ourselves and how we do, how in our own economic well-being. And that's the problem that legislators have to deal with, is that all of these groups come to the Capitol every year and say, my business can't make it without this exemption. The film industry would be destroyed without the credits that they get. I mean, it goes on and on. So at the end of the day, it's to come up with a fair system. And I'm hoping that the legislature will come up with it, because if they don't, we will end up continuing. If they don't come up with any reform, I'm assuming the only thing we would be left to do is to renew the regressive taxes that we impose. We now have the highest sales tax in the country in a state that has more than its fair share of people in poverty. So we have a fundamentally unfair system, and as you pointed out, you're worried about your constituent base, but at the end of the day, whatever system we come up has to be fair, and that'll be the big decisions
we have,
that we'll have to make.
Well over $1 billion in new revenue and through exemptions and whatnot that were canceled that 2 years from now are going to go away. So is that, Representative White, going to be an encouragement and incentive for the legislature to sit down and do real reform?
I personally believe that is the incentive, and I think there's going to be many conversations and dialogue between legislators, the governor, and business and industry, that we will hopefully be able to work out something that is considered fair and be able to continue to grow the economy in Louisiana without hurting it so much. It means jobs and opportunities for all of us. And as a business person, I completely understand that. It's going to be it's going to be a challenge to find that balance, but I don't think that we have any choice in that matter. And I think that the more that we come to the table together to figure that out, the better off that we will all be, and less of impact on any one particular sector.
Austin, one of our students, had a question about one of the big ticket items in the exemption area. Austin, why don't you ask them about that?
So the film tax credit, I'm sure that's the highlight on every 17-year-old boy's mind. What's going on with the film tax credit? So basically my question is directed towards the legislators. So essentially the film tax credit, I know, was capped at $180 million. That would be, essentially dedicated to it for this year. Speaking from a business standpoint, or from the idea of fairness, how would that, in your opinion, or does that, in your opinion, affect business negatively or positively, being that it is capped and there's no more money that could be spent on that?
I mean, anytime you give someone a credit, you have to look at the benefits of that credit. Do they bring anything extra to the table, other than a bunch of lobbyists to Baton Rouge to cry about how they can't survive without it? And we think, at least in my opinion, the film tax credit is way too generous. If you just look at what other southern states are doing, or what other states are doing across the country, ours is too generous. And I don't think the net benefit to the state as a whole is worth the credit that we hand out. And I'm sure that'll be addressed in the spring.
Dr. Richardson, do you have a view on the film tax credit?
I think if you look at all the studies that have been done, you find what Eric said is correct, and that is in the sense of the dollars that we pay out in the credit are substantially more than the dollars we get back as a state in other tax collections. So from that pure very benefit cost ratio, the state does not win. There's no doubt, on the other hand, if you look at a credit that has created some activity, it creates some interest, it does that very well. It just does not bring back the dollars that's sufficient to offset it.
Let me ask Representative White. I mean, has Hollywood South gone south, and should it stay there?
I think we still have activities going on. I know that we do. However, I know that it's a very competitive within all the states to try to lure that film industry to them. However, I think that what we're searching for right now is a true audit process so that we do see a good return on investment and really look at that and anything to do with tax credits. Are we employing the people that we say we were when we were getting the tax credits to begin with? And that's just not in film industry, but within the industry as a whole. And I think that a real true focus on that will tell the tale.
John L.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think someone spoke about everyone, I think Chairman LaFleur, about everyone being self-interested, which is entirely the case. I myself, I'm a state worker. I have an older brother with spinal bifida, so I know firsthand what the Medicare system can do for patients. I attended a public school. I didn't qualify for TOPS, but I do know over the last 10 years higher education has really just been raised at such a tremendous amount. So I guess my question, and it will be to Chairman LaFleur, is after this session, which was the longest in state history, if I read it correctly,
right,
are you more confident or less confident in the long-term health financially of this state?
Well, I mean, my concern is that the votes that we took at this point were all temporary in nature and fairly easy to make because they were only temporary and it was only a fix to get us to the following year. These next votes that we're going to make, if they're truly going to be structural changes, the kind that the Commission will present, I guess we'll pick from their menu of items, those votes are going to be much harder. And I just hope that the guys that I serve with and the women that I serve with have the political will to put the state on a track where we see every year regular revenue, not necessarily increasing at extraordinary rates, but increasing at an appropriate rate to sustain government and the basic services that we provide so that kids that are in high school who have planned out 4 years of their lives trying to get to the ACT score that they need get what they've worked for so many years. And so we just need something that's long-term and reliable. And that's part of the reason why I think Dr. Richardson would agree that the credit agencies are looking at us as downgrading, or we've been downgraded, and I think we've been on watch because people look at us as a fiscal house a state that doesn't have its fiscal house in order.
That's not in order. Dr. Richardson.
Yeah, let me, the senators and the representatives will have a tremendously tough job, but you know, it's going to be more than them. It's the people of the state. Many of the things that we have to change are constitutional. So in a certain sense, we're going to ask the representatives and the senators to give you an opportunity to speak your minds about what we should do. And we have to do it as a community. Are we prepared to vote for some of these things? And there's no doubt, anytime you suggest a change in a tax, there are going to be certain people who like it personally, and certain people who may not like it quite as much. There's no way to get around that. There's no way to get around that. And we just have to talk. That's why we have to make sure when we do it that we aren't aiming at any one sector of the economy or not aiming at any one group of people, or trying to make it just as fair as possible horizontally across people with the same income or vertically people with different incomes. And that's hard to do, and people have different ideas of what's good there. But I think we have to put it out there on the table like that, and it's going to be a choice of the people as well as a choice of our legislators.
Well, Dr. Richardson, you touched on something that Kelly has a big global question about. This is important. Go ahead.
Okay. My interest, of course, selfish here. It's for special needs community. And I do understand and really sympathize with everyone. I was a beneficiary of TOPS. I got paid $800 a semester to go to school on top of everything being paid for me. I get it. It's needed. It's necessary. But the people I work with, we're not asking to go to college. We're asking for them to be able to breathe. Yeah, basic needs. We're asking for them to maybe be able to eat like you and I can eat, like you and I can sit here and talk. We're asking for help to get them to that point. Is there any possibility of a constitutional convention, something being put in the Constitution to secure funds for the waiver services, or possibly even expand the budget for the waiver services to include people that have been on the waiting list for 10 plus years.
So you both want to sustain funding, but there's a lot of people who aren't getting the support.
Thousands, that are sitting here dying, waiting.
As far as the Constitution goes, there's a lot of dedicated funding out there that we can't touch. And I think that sometimes it gets off balance in the way I see it, as far as even running your household. You can put your monies aside for something and then something else breaks loose. It's the same way in the state, so I'm very hesitant to dedicate funding, in my opinion, because of that. And we've seen it. However, I completely understand the need for those waivers. I too have a Down syndrome uncle. All he knows is love. And he would like to remain independent in his home. And his mother, my grandmother, is 94 years old with an amputated leg. So I get it. I understand that, and I've seen it. And the funding is very critical. It's very important, as well as everything else. They are all citizens of this state, and many of them, of their parents and the caregivers, have paid their dues to receive that type service. So I understand and I completely get it, and work very, very hard in trying to get the funds for it.
And Ms. DeLotte, you've been watching the legislature in action for so many years, and there's all types of lobbyists that come. But this is a particularly different kind of lobbying group. And what's your perception of how impactful they are? And explain to others what it's like every year when the folks come in favor of the waivers.
Well, what you have every year during the Appropriations and Senate Finance Committee process is you see a lot of family members of people with disabilities who show up in yellow shirts. And you will see them pack committee rooms. This year, you saw actually different kinds of shirts because so many people were facing budget cuts. But they will pack committees, and they will buttonhole legislators. I'm sure Senator LaFleur has had that happen, and Representative White, and they spend a lot of time advocating for disability services. I think they're very impactful. I think you have seen, particularly in these 3 sessions, you had folks who showed up in every tax committee hearing to pitch that money was needed to be raised to help them cover their services. Also, the testimony is so emotional, and the people have such personal and real stories that, particularly in Senator LaFleur's committee, there were lots of days where there were senators crying, listening to the testimony of the parents and siblings of children and grown-ups who can't speak for themselves in some instances and who need help from the state in some fashion. And it clearly was impactful in the level of the waiver programs. The Medicaid waiver programs didn't actually get cut, and they were really threatened with cuts for quite a long time. So it clearly made a difference to see those people here every year. But it is just kind of a commentary on the absurdities of the Louisiana budget process from year to year. But these folks in these yellow shirts are so well known because they have to show up year after year after year after year because their services are never protected.
Well, Ms. DeLotte and Senator LaFleur, have we seen more and more lobbyists over the years, or fewer? How's that?
Okay. I think Melinda will agree, but you'll see more lobbyists next year than you've ever seen before. For everybody that's going to be affected by any tax that we're going to bring, regardless of the measure, somebody's going to be there to represent those.
Every tax,
people.
every exemption, every credit. Yeah,
we'll
have a full house.
Yeah, the problem with taxes, politicians they're also rational thinkers too, and they like to take the path of least resistance. And in order to bring reform, it requires you to take difficult votes, tough votes, that require you to do more than just go home and say nothing. It requires you to go home and go to every chamber meeting, every Rotary Club meeting, appear on these kind of programs, so that you can explain the rationale behind that vote, so that you can get the support of people who otherwise would be against you because you passed a tax upon them. But it requires a lot of work because you have to engage the public, you have to let them know what you're doing and why you're doing it. So if you are, for example, the guys with the yellow shirts, you don't know who those people are unless you happen to have a child who, no choice of your own, is disabled for some reason and requires this extra attention. Once that message gets to the legislators, they tend to think differently. It's the same thing with taxes. You've got to make people think differently about what you're voting on because they just look at it as a tax and they don't understand the rationale behind it. And politicians who like to get reelected like to go home and say, I voted against all the taxes, so I'm good to get reelected. Politicians who are trying to make a difference will go home and try to explain themselves and the rationale and find the support that it takes to make those difficult points.
And our most rational representative on this panel, Representative White, what do you think?
Well, that's what I witnessed this year. It takes a lot of courage to make the hard decisions and to realize the impacts that it is making upon every one of us. It's also self-imposed. I think a lot of people feel that as a politician that this doesn't impact you as well financially, and it does. As a business owner, it does. And yet at the same time, you have to realize that you want and need these services, and they must be funded. And then you hear about fraud and frivolous spending and things like that, and yet we have to work hard at following that and making sure that we are weeding out those things. That doesn't happen overnight. The workings of con artists are not so easily unraveled, as I've said before. But the courage that it takes to do that is something that I was very surprised by this year. I will go on record in saying that I was elected to serve these 4 years. And as I say that, I've been called a fool not to look at re-election, but I feel that if we really pull together independently and unite in what we do, and we can really fix the problems of Louisiana and bring us up to the level that we're not at the bottom of all state records of comparisons, then I believe that we don't have to worry about our sunset dates. I believe that we will be reelected and do things that is right for the people as a whole. That's the way I feel about it as a freshman, and I pray that I continue to be that way throughout this process.
So even after all that, you're still encouraging, and I like to hear that. One of our students, Taylor, had a question about values and how you make decisions. Taylor?
Hi, I was wondering which items were put at priority when deciding what money goes where with the budget this year.
I can answer that for myself. I have a private partnership in my district, and I have a rural hospital, and that is it. We're a very rural area. So when it came to the decision between funding TOPS fully and funding the hospitals, I will tell you the example I used many, many times. If any legislator came through my area, or anyone, and came upon a car accident with a young person involved, you would not throw a $1,000 bill at that student and say good luck in college. You would get them to the nearest hospital. Had ours been shuttered due to lack of funding, which they've already taken losses in the past, then that would have meant an hour, hour and a half to 2 hours, depending on if you're insured or not, and you don't have that kind of time. And it was a matter of life over death for me. Although I take education very highly and support of it, we have to deliver our babies and keep them healthy to get to college, and so for me, top priority was our hospitals.
Taylor, that was a great question. Appreciate it. And the gentleman next to you, Scott, is a regular at the Capitol, supporting schools, and well known to some of the folks here. Scott, you had a question for the panel, and let me guess what that might be.
Well, I guess at the end of the day, it's about deciding needs versus wants and prioritizing obligations, and certainly the best investment the legislature can make, in the view of many, is that K-12 education should be a priority, and unfortunately, it didn't receive the same level of funding as it has in the previous year. But we're hopeful that the mechanisms in place with task force committees on a number of various topics can bring some rational solutions that'll bring all the stakeholders to the table, and the red and blue and DC style politics that exist in our state based on the last several weeks of legislative sessions can kind of dissipate, and more rational thought can come to the table. And at the end of the day, we would hope to see that public education is a priority, along with several of the other topics that were mentioned here today. The main question that K-12 educators and parents want to know is why wasn't K-12 fully funded, or at least maintained at the same level from last year?
How about Senator LaFleur?
Well, listen, it's an important part of the budget. It eats up more money than any other item that we pay for in state government. I think the MFP is around $3.6 billion. The cuts that were imposed on K through 12 was a very small amount. It was less than 1/10, I think, of 1%, the total amount that goes. I think it's not so much the dollars that were cut, it was just the symbolism behind us not fully funding it. And it appears, because when you tell any school board that we cut 40-something million dollars out of K through 12 education, that's a big number. But in the big picture, it's a very small number. But symbolically, yes, it's an indication that our priorities, or it's a representation that our priorities are not very high.
That's the first time we've seen that happen. Rebecca, our journalist, you're going to get the last question and make it a quick one.
Okay. I think that a lot of people would be wondering, moving forward when we're talking about stabilizing the budget and reform coming next year, why should people be optimistic that this year will be any different? You've had opportunities in previous years. There's been a cliff every year. You had opportunities in the regular session, and there would seem to be a lot of gridlock.
All right, who wants to take that one?
Well, I mean, we repealed the Stelly plan, and that basically set us on course for non-recurring revenue with a small growth every year. I mean, the fact of the matter was Stelly the revenue increased in too large a number. I don't think it was all attributable to Stelly. I think Dr. Richardson would agree with that.
What about you, Dr. Richardson?
The windfall from a couple of storms.
Again, optimism, I think realistically, yes. The resolution that created the task force for structural reform was authored by a number of people, Republicans and Democrats, and they all appreciate that it's going to make hard decisions that they have to make. Now, when they see everything, will they be up to it? I think they'll do their very best. So I'm optimistic from that perspective. But do I think it's going to be easy? No, it's not. It's going to
do their best, and it's not going to be easy. And unfortunately, we've run out of time for our question and answer segment. We'd like to thank our panelists, Senator LaFleur, Ms. DeLotte, Dr. Richardson, and Representative White, for your insight on this month's topic. When we come back, we'll have a few closing comments.
Well, Robert, we always get down to no one really wants taxes, difficult choices coming up in the future. And I guess it was interesting that Stelly was passed by the people of Louisiana, but then it was turned over so quickly, mainly because we had additional revenue following all the hurricanes. So we never know what disaster is going to befall, or maybe some extraordinary news event.
It had a long-term impact, but now look, after everything the legislators have been through, they're still a little bit optimistic. They know it's tough, but they were encouraging. At least we have that going for us.
And we're all looking forward to Dr. Richardson and your task force that you're on as well.
We're going to come up with some answers. Okay, we'll come up with it. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Louisiana Public Square. We encourage you to visit our website at lpb.org/public square. And while you're there, please comment on tonight's show. We'd love to hear from you.
Indeed, we would. You know, on next month's Louisiana Public Square, we'll explore the unrest sparked by the fatal police shooting of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge. His death reignited a national debate on how law enforcement interacts with minority communities. Tune in Wednesday, August the 17th. And thanks for watching this evening. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.
Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.